The actress who sang for the president before the world, but behind the scenes kept a deadly secret. The Washington evening air was thick with anticipation as Mary Muntroud stepped out of the black Lincoln Town car, her emerald evening gown catching the last rays of the setting sun. The Crystal Palace, an architectural marvel that served as the venue for President Edward Callaway's birthday celebration, loomed before her like a challenge. Security personnel dressed in dark suits lined the entrance, their earpieces gleaming as they watched her every move. Her heart thundered in her chest, but years of performance training had taught her to maintain her composure, even when every instinct screamed at her to run. The grand foyer buzzed with the quiet murmur of America's political elite, their designer clothes and perfectly coiffed hair marking them as members of a world Mary had only observed from afar. As she made her way through the crowd, she could feel their stares, some curious, others dismissive, and a few openly hostile. A senator's wife whispered behind her hand to her companion, both of them watching Mary with thinly veiled disdain. She recognized them from the society pages, the old guard who believed that entertainers had no place in such gatherings, especially not ones with her background. The marble floor clicked beneath her heels as she followed a young aide toward the preparation room. The walls were adorned with portraits of past presidents, their stern faces seeming to judge her presence in these hallowed halls. She caught fragments of conversations about trade deals, upcoming bills, and political alliances, reminders that this was no ordinary performance venue. This was the heart of American power, and she was about to perform for its most influential occupants. The weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. A flash of movement caught her eye, and she glimpsed President Callaway himself through a doorway, surrounded by advisors. Even from this distance, his presence was magnetic. Tall and distinguished with silver threading through his dark hair, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the room, and Mary felt an unexpected jolt of electricity run through her. He offered a slight nod, almost imperceptible, before turning back to his conversation. The interaction lasted mere seconds, but it left her oddly unsettled. The preparation room was a stark contrast to the opulence outside, all business and functionality. Her guitar case was already there, brought in earlier by the staff. As she began her warm-up routine, her fingers moving automatically across the strings, she could hear the growing crowd through the walls. The aide had left a program on the side table. She was to perform 3 songs, carefully selected and approved by the White House staff. What they didn't know was that music had always been her form of rebellion, her way of speaking truths that couldn't be said in mere words. Time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously as she waited for her cue. She thought of her father, who had always encouraged her music but warned her about the dangers of getting too close to power. If he could see her now, standing in the Crystal Palace about to perform for the President of the United States, what would he say? The memory of his arrest during the union protests years ago flashed through her mind, but she pushed it away. Tonight wasn't about the past. It was about surviving the present. The call finally came, and Mary rose with practiced grace. As she walked toward the main hall, the sound of her heartbeat nearly drowned out the announcement of her name. The crowd parted before her, creating a path to the small stage that had been set up at one end of the magnificent room. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, their light reflecting off the polished surfaces of the room like thousands of watching eyes. She took her position, adjusted her guitar, and looked out over the sea of expectant faces. President Callaway sat in the front row, flanked by Secret Service agents and what appeared to be senior staff members. Among them, she noticed Senator McCandy, whose reputation for political maneuvering preceded him. His sharp eyes were fixed on her, with an intensity that made her skin crawl, but she refused to let it shake her. Instead, she focused on her breathing, on the familiar weight of her guitar, on the songs she had prepared. This was her element, the one place where she truly knew who she was. The first notes rang out clear and true, filling the vast space with a melody that seemed to capture the complexity of the moment. As she began to sing, she watched the faces of her audience transform. The dismissive looks gave way to surprise, then appreciation. Even the most hardened political operators couldn't help but be moved by the raw emotion in her voice. She had chosen a song about hope and change, about the dreams of ordinary people, themes that resonated even in this rarefied atmosphere. President Calloway leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable but intense. By the time she finished her set, the room had fallen under her spell. The applause was genuine, enthusiastic, and for a moment, Mary allowed herself to feel a flash of triumph. But as she caught sight of Senator McCandy whispering something to an aide while staring directly at her, she felt a chill run down her spine. She had succeeded in making an impression, but something told her that this was only the beginning. As she took her final bow, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped onto a much larger stage, one where the stakes were far higher than any performance she had given before. The mahogany-paneled conference room felt like a trap. Mary sat at the massive table, her performance gown now feeling like armor as she faced Senator McCandy and his associates. The room was located in a quiet wing of the Crystal Palace, far from the dying echoes of the celebration. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Washington Monument stood as a silent sentinel in the distance, its illuminated form a stark contrast to the darkness gathering inside. The senator's smile never reached his eyes as he gestured for his aide to close the door, the soft click of the latch sounding ominously final. "Miss Muntroud," McCandy began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a career politician, "your performance tonight was quite inspiring." He pulled a leather folder from his briefcase, placing it carefully on the table between them. "Almost as inspiring as your father's speeches during the steel mill strikes of 2019. The mention of her father sent ice through Mary's veins, but she kept her expression neutral. The senator opened the folder with deliberate slowness, revealing photographs and documents she had never seen before. Thomas Muntroud was quite the firebrand, wasn't he? Until that unfortunate incident with the classified documents. The air in the room grew thicker as McCandy's associates shifted positions, forming a subtle barrier between Mary and the door. Through the fog of rising panic, she noticed security cameras in the corners of the room had been turned off, their red lights dark. The senator continued speaking, his words measured and precise, laying out a history she had never known, or perhaps had never wanted to know. Documents detailing her father's alleged collaboration with foreign agents, transcripts of meetings that had never made it into the official record, and photographs that seemed to tell a story of betrayal rather than the labor activism she had grown up believing in. "Your father's case was, shall we say, handled quietly," McCandy continued, his fingers drumming a soft rhythm on the folder. "For the good of national security, of course, and for the good of his family." The implication hung in the air, like poison gas. Mary's mind raced through memories of her father's sudden retirement, his unexpected move to a small town in Montana, the way he had discouraged her from following in his activist footsteps. Everything she had attributed to disillusionment now took on a darker shade. The senator watched her process this information with the patience of a predator waiting for its prey to exhaust itself. The proposition, when it came, was wrapped in the language of opportunity. McCandy spoke of influence and reach, of the power of music to shape public opinion. He described a role for her: performances at carefully selected events, social media posts supporting certain policies, casual meetings with influential figures who needed gentle persuasion. "Your voice could serve a greater purpose," he suggested, leaning forward. "The administration needs artists who understand the importance of unity." The word dripped with menace, despite his pleasant tone. The choice he offered was no choice at all: become their puppet or watch her father's reputation destroyed and her own career crushed. Mary's hands clenched in her lap, hidden beneath the table as she fought to maintain her composure. The room seemed to shrink around her as McCandy laid out the consequences of refusal. Not just her father's exposed past, but her own carefully built career would be systematically dismantled. The senator had connections with every major venue, every recording label, every streaming platform. The music industry can be quite volatile, he remarked with false sympathy. Careers end every day for the smallest of reasons. His associates nodded in silent agreement, their presence a reminder of the machine she was up against. A knock at the door interrupted the tension, and President Calloway himself stepped into the room. His entrance shifted the dynamic immediately. McCandy and his men straightening in their chairs, their predatory focus momentarily disrupted. The president's expression was unreadable as he surveyed the scene, but Mary caught a flicker of something in his eyes when they met hers. "Senator," he said, his voice carrying authority without effort, "I believe you're needed in the main hall. The Japanese ambassador is asking for you specifically." It was clearly a dismissal, though wrapped in diplomatic courtesy. McCandy hesitated for a moment, caught between his power play and the president's implicit command. Finally, he gathered his materials, sliding the folder back into his briefcase. "Think about what we discussed, Miss Muntroud," he said as he stood. "We'll be in touch soon." The threat remained in his voice, even in the president's presence. His entourage filed out behind him, leaving Mary alone with Calloway in the suddenly quiet room. The tension changed character, but didn't dissipate. Instead, it took on an electric quality that made her pulse quicken for entirely different reasons. President Calloway moved to the windows, his back to her as he gazed out at the Washington night. "The gardens are beautiful this time of year," he said after a long moment, his voice softer than it had been with McCandy. "Would you care to take a walk?" The invitation surprised her, as did the gentleness in his tone. He turned to face her, and in the dim light of the room she saw complexity in his expression, concern, interest, and something else she couldn't quite name. The power dynamics had shifted again, but she wasn't sure if she was any safer than she had been moments ago. The choice lay before her like a crossroads. Stay in this room with its lingering threats and heavy air, or step into the garden with a man who wielded more power than anyone else in the country. A man who had just witnessed her vulnerability, but whose own motivations remained obscure. Mary stood slowly, smoothing her dress with hands that had finally stopped trembling. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I think some fresh air would be nice." As she followed him toward the garden doors, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into another kind of trap, one perhaps more dangerous because it called to something deep within her, something that had nothing to do with politics or power, and everything to do with the way her heart beat faster when he looked at her. Dawn crept over Washington, D.C. as Mary stood at her apartment window, watching the city slowly come to life. Her evening gown from the Crystal Palace lay draped over a chair, a glittering reminder of the previous night's events. The morning light caught the sequins, sending fractured reflections dancing across her walls like scattered thoughts. She hadn't slept, her mind replaying every moment of her conversation with President Calloway in the garden. His words had been careful, measured, yet there had been moments when something raw and genuine seemed to break through the polished political exterior. The way he had spoken about the pressure of leadership, the isolation of power, it had felt real. But then again, he hadn't directly addressed McCandy's threats, and his ambiguous responses to her careful questions left her wondering if this was all part of a more sophisticated manipulation. The buzz of her phone interrupted her reverie. The screen displayed a series of news notifications, all featuring her name. The coverage of her performance at the president's birthday celebration was overwhelming. Photos of her on stage, snippets of praise from influential attendees, even a brief quote from Calloway himself, calling her performance transformative. But mixed in with the glowing reviews were subtle hints of the undercurrent she now knew existed. Several articles mentioned her father's Union background, though none went into the darker details McCandy had revealed. One conservative blog questioned the appropriateness of her selection as entertainment for such a prestigious event. The machinery of public opinion was already in motion, and she could feel the gears turning beneath the surface. A knock at her door made her jump. Through the peephole, she saw a familiar face that brought both relief and complexity. Daniel Reynolds, her childhood friend turned investigative journalist. He stood in the hallway, in his characteristic rumpled suit, a tablet tucked under one arm, and concern etched across his features. When she opened the door, he didn't wait for an invitation before stepping inside, his eyes scanning her apartment with professional paranoia. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. "But first, we need to make sure we can actually talk." He pulled out a small electronic device and began moving it around the room, checking for surveillance equipment. Mary watched him work, torn between amusement at what seemed like excessive caution and a growing sense of unease. Daniel had always been intense about his investigations, but this was different. He moved with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for and exactly what was at stake. When he finally finished his sweep and seemed satisfied, he turned to her with an expression that made her heart sink. "You're being watched," he said without preamble. "FBI, private contractors, probably Secret Service too. They've been following you since before the performance last night. This isn't just about music anymore, Mary." The revelation shouldn't have surprised her after McCandy's threats, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a way that turned her stomach. Daniel pulled up documents on his tablet, surveillance logs, internal memos, redacted reports. His sources within the government had been feeding him information for weeks, painting a picture of an operation that went far beyond normal security procedures for a presidential event. "They're treating you like a potential asset," he explained, his journalist's detachment warring with personal concern, "or a potential threat. Maybe both. The question is why." What happened in that private meeting with McCandy? She told him everything. The blackmail attempt, her father's alleged betrayal, the pressure to become their political puppet. Daniel listened intently, occasionally making notes but mostly watching her face as she spoke. When she got to the part about President Calloway's intervention and their garden conversation, something flickered in Daniel's eyes. "Be careful with Calloway," he warned, setting aside his tablet. "Just because he played the hero doesn't mean he's not part of this. Sometimes the good cop is just as dangerous as the bad cop." His hand found hers on the kitchen counter, a gesture of support that carried echoes of their shared past. The touch sparked memories of simpler times, high school performances where Daniel sat in the front row, late-night conversations about their dreams, the almost kiss at her first major concert that they'd both pretended to forget. He had always been her anchor, the one person she could trust completely. But now, as he outlined his theories about Calloway's possible involvement in McCandy's scheme, she found herself wanting to defend the president. The connection she'd felt in the garden hadn't felt like manipulation, or had she simply wanted so badly to believe in someone powerful enough to protect her that she'd ignored the signs. Daniel's phone buzzed with a news alert, breaking the moment between them. He checked it, and his expression darkened. "They're moving faster than I expected," he said, showing her the screen. It was an announcement of her selection as a cultural ambassador for a new White House initiative, complete with quotes from her that she had never given. The machinery wasn't just moving, it was already reconstructing her public identity. "They're not giving you a choice," Daniel continued, his voice tight with anger. "They're going to wrap you in the flag and use you until there's nothing left of the real you." The weight of it all suddenly felt crushing. Mary sank onto her couch, the exhaustion of the sleepless night finally catching up with her. Daniel sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, a reminder of the one constant in her life. "I don't know who to trust anymore," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Daniel's hand found her shoulder, and the comfort of his touch warred with the memory of how her skin had tingled when Calloway's fingers had brushed hers in the garden. "Trust me," Daniel said simply, but she could hear the layers in his voice, the protectiveness, the history, the unspoken feelings that had always simmered beneath their friendship. He pulled a small device from his pocket, similar to the one he'd used to sweep her apartment. "Keep this with you. It'll detect most surveillance equipment. And," he hesitated, then continued, "be careful around Calloway. I've been investigating his administration for months. There are things about him, connections that don't add up. Promise me you won't let your guard down just because he has a charming smile and good timing." The sun had fully risen now, painting her apartment in harsh light that seemed to strip away all illusions. Mary looked at the device in her hand, then at Daniel's worried face, and finally at her reflection in the window. 3 versions of herself stared back: the artist she had always been, the political tool they wanted her to become, and something else, something emerging in the space between power and authenticity. "I promise to be careful," she said finally, but even as the words left her mouth, she wasn't sure which man she needed to be more careful around: the president who might be manipulating her, or the friend whose concern might be colored by feelings neither of them had ever fully acknowledged. The White House private dining room glowed softly in the candlelight, the flames casting dancing shadows across the historic walls. Mary sat across from President Calloway, acutely aware of the intimacy of the setting, despite the 2 Secret Service agents positioned discreetly by the doors. The table between them was small, forcing a closeness that made her pulse quicken. She wore a simple black dress that felt both appropriate and somehow inadequate for dining with the most powerful man in the world. Calloway had shed his suit jacket, his rolled-up sleeves and loosened tie suggesting a deliberate attempt at informality. Yet power radiated from him like heat from a flame, impossible to ignore even in this seemingly relaxed setting. "I hope you don't mind the private setting," Calloway said, pouring her a glass of wine that probably cost more than her monthly rent. "Sometimes these walls are the only place I can speak freely." His fingers brushed hers as he handed her the glass, and she felt that same electric connection from the garden. The wine was deep red, almost black in the low light. "McCandy has eyes and ears everywhere else in Washington," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "Even here, we have to be careful." Mary's hand instinctively moved to touch the detection device Daniel had given her, hidden in her clutch. It hadn't registered any surveillance in this room, but that didn't necessarily mean they were truly alone. The first course arrived, carried in by staff who moved with practiced silence. Mary watched Calloway interact with them, the way he thanked each one by name, the genuine warmth in his smile. It didn't feel like the act of a manipulative politician, but then again, the best acts never did. She thought of Daniel's warnings, of the documents he'd shown her suggesting connections between Calloway's administration and various shadow operations. Yet sitting here, watching the president's guard drop slightly with each passing moment, she found herself wanting to believe in the man rather than the conspiracy. "I know you have questions," Calloway said after the staff had withdrawn, "about McCandy, about your father, about why you're really here." He set down his fork, giving her his full attention. "The truth is complicated, Mary. This administration inherited a power structure that's been in place for decades. Men like McCandy, they're like a cancer in the system. But you can't just cut out cancer without considering what it's attached to." His words seemed genuine, tinged with frustration and what sounded like regret. But they were also calculated, revealing just enough to draw her in while leaving the deeper mysteries intact. The main course arrived, perfectly cooked salmon on a bed of asparagus, but Mary barely tasted it. She was too focused on reading between Calloway's carefully chosen words, searching for the truth behind his diplomatic language. He spoke of pressure from various factions, of the delicate balance required to maintain stability while working toward change. "Sometimes," he said, his eyes holding hers, "you have to play their game to change the rules." The sentiment echoed her own thoughts about using music to convey deeper messages, but the stakes in his game were exponentially higher. Lives hung in the balance of every decision he made. As they talked, Mary found herself opening up despite her reservations. She told him about growing up in a union household, about the music that had saved her when her father's sudden departure had upended their lives. Calloway listened with an intensity that made her feel truly seen, not just observed. When she mentioned her fears about being used as a political tool, his hand moved across the table to cover hers. The touch sent warmth spreading up her arm, and she had to remind herself that this man might be part of the very system threatening to destroy her. "I want to protect you," he said softly, his thumb tracing small circles on her wrist. "But I need you to trust me, even when things don't make sense, even when it seems like I'm working against you." The request hung in the air between them, weighted with implications. Mary thought of Daniel's research, of McCandy's threats, of the surveillance that had followed her every move since the Crystal Palace. Trust felt like a luxury she couldn't afford, yet something in Calloway's eyes made her want to risk it. The dessert went untouched as the conversation deepened. Calloway moved to the small sofa near the fireplace and gestured for her to join him. The Secret Service agents adjusted their positions but maintained their discretion. Sitting beside him, Mary could smell his cologne, something expensive but subtle, like his power. He spoke about his own journey to the presidency, the compromises he'd had to make, the ideals he'd had to bend but never break. With each word, the line between sincerity and manipulation became increasingly blurred. It happened almost naturally. A pause in conversation, a shared look that lasted too long, the magnetic pull of attraction that had been building since their first meeting. Calloway's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch impossibly gentle for someone who commanded such power. Mary knew she should pull away, remember Daniel's warnings, maintain her defenses. Instead, she found herself leaning into his touch, her heart racing as his lips moved closer to hers. The kiss, when it came, was both tender and overwhelming. His lips were soft but insistent, speaking of carefully controlled passion and promises he might not be able to keep. Mary's hands found their way to his chest, feeling his heartbeat through the expensive fabric of his shirt. For a moment, the world beyond this room ceased to exist. There was only this connection, this dangerous and intoxicating fusion of attraction and power. But then Daniel's face flashed in her mind, along with all his warnings, and she pulled away abruptly. Calloway didn't try to stop her, but his eyes held a mix of understanding and something darker, more determined. As she gathered her things to leave, his words followed her. Sometimes the heart knows what the mind refuses to accept. She couldn't tell if it was a comfort or a threat, and that uncertainty followed her all the way home, where she lay awake, wondering if she had just found an ally or fallen into the most sophisticated trap of all. Rain pounded against the windows of Daniel's apartment, the weather matching the dark mood inside. Spread across his dining room table were dozens of classified documents, their pages marked with government seals and heavy redactions. Daniel moved between them with the focused intensity of a man assembling a puzzle, while Mary sat frozen in her chair, staring at a photograph she wished she had never seen. It showed her father, Thomas Muntroud, in what appeared to be a clandestine meeting with foreign operatives taken just days before the infamous steel mill strike that had ended his career. The timestamp on the photo mocked everything she thought she had known about that period of her life. "There's more," Daniel said quietly, sliding another folder toward her. His hand lingered near hers, offering silent support as she opened it. Inside were surveillance reports, detailed accounts of her father's movements in the weeks leading up to his death. The official story had been a heart attack, sudden but natural. These documents told a different tale. Mary's hands trembled as she read the clinical descriptions of orchestrated accidents, contingency plans, and finally, the execution of Protocol 27, a euphemism for elimination that made her stomach turn. Through her tears, she saw McCandy's name appearing repeatedly in the chain of command. Daniel moved around the table to stand behind her chair, his presence solid and reassuring as she processed the truth. "My source risked everything to get these files," he explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. "McCandy wasn't just involved in the cover-up, he personally ordered the operation. The strike was getting too much attention, and your father had evidence of corporate corruption that went all the way to the Senate." His hands came to rest on her shoulders, and Mary found herself leaning back into his touch, seeking anchor in a world that was rapidly spinning out of control. The comfort of his familiar presence contrasted sharply with the memory of Calloway's kiss, which still burned on her lips. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulous. Daniel had spent months piecing it together, following leads, verifying sources. Mary watched him work as he laid out the connections, a web of corruption that stretched from local union busters to the highest levels of government. Her father had stumbled onto something bigger than labor disputes, something that threatened the power structure itself. And now, years later, she found herself entangled in the same web. The revelation that McCandy had orchestrated her father's death made his recent threats feel even more sinister. This wasn't just about controlling her voice, it was about maintaining the silence that had already cost one Muntraud their life. Thunder crashed outside as Daniel pulled up digital files on his computer, showing her email chains and financial records that his sources had uncovered. The corruption went deeper than anyone had suspected, touching every level of government. "The question is," he said, running a hand through his already disheveled hair, "how much does Calloway know?" He turned to face her, his expression troubled. "Mary, I know there's something happening between you and him. I saw how you looked at each other at the Crystal Palace, and now this private dinner." He trailed off, unable to completely hide the pain in his voice. The moment hung between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. Mary stood abruptly, needing to move, to think. She paced Daniel's living room, her mind racing through implications. Every interaction with Calloway took on new meaning in light of these revelations. His words in the private dining room about inherited power structures and playing their game seemed more ominous now. Had he known about her father's death when he kissed her? Was his apparent attraction to her genuine or part of a larger strategy to keep her under control? The questions made her head spin, and she found herself stopping at Daniel's window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Daniel's reflection appeared behind her in the window, his concern evident even in the distorted image. "I know this is overwhelming," he said softly, "but you need to understand what you're dealing with. These people, McCandy, his associates, maybe even Calloway, they'll do anything to maintain their power." He stepped closer, and Mary could feel the heat of his body just inches from her back. "I can't lose you the way we lost your father." The raw emotion in his voice made her turn to face him, and suddenly they were standing too close. The air between them charged with years of unspoken feelings and shared history. Time seemed to stop as they stood there, the rain creating a curtain of white noise that isolated them from the world outside. Daniel's hand came up to brush a tear from her cheek, and the tenderness of the gesture broke something inside her. She found herself moving closer, seeking comfort in his familiarity. Their foreheads touched, and Mary closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the competing emotions coursing through her. Grief for her father, fear of the forces arrayed against her, confusion about Calloway, and this ever-present pull toward Daniel that she had never fully acknowledged. The moment stretched, balanced on a knife's edge of possibility. Daniel's breath mingled with hers, his hands now resting lightly on her waist. It would be so easy to close the distance, to lose herself in the safety of his arms and the certainty of his feelings for her. But Calloway's face flashed in her mind, the intensity of his gaze, the electricity of his touch, and she pulled back slightly. Daniel let her go immediately, understanding and hurt warring in his expression. They stood in awkward silence until another crash of thunder made them both jump, breaking the spell. Moving back to the table of evidence, Mary forced herself to focus on the documents rather than the lingering tension in the room. "We need to be smart about this," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "If McCandy really killed my father, we need proof that will stand up in public, and we need to figure out exactly where Calloway stands." She didn't look at Daniel as she spoke, afraid of what she might see in his eyes. Instead, she stared at the photograph of her father, drawing strength from his memory. The rain continued to pour outside, washing away the last traces of the simpler world she had known just days ago, leaving her caught between the man who had always been her rock and the dangerous attraction of power that might be her undoing. The knock on Mary's apartment door came just after midnight. She had been sitting at her piano trying to compose, but producing only discordant fragments that matched her troubled thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Secret Service agents in the hallway, and her heart skipped a beat. Before she could process what that meant, President Calloway stepped into view. He wasn't wearing a tie, and his usual polished appearance showed signs of strain. Mary glanced around her apartment. Sheet music scattered across the floor, coffee cups on every surface, and Daniel's surveillance detector lying conspicuously on the coffee table. She quickly slipped the device into a drawer before opening the door. "I apologize for the late hour," Calloway said as he entered, dismissing his agents to the hallway with a subtle gesture. He looked out of place in her modest apartment, his presence making the space feel simultaneously smaller and more significant. His eyes took in the organized chaos of her living room, the guitar propped against the wall, the stack of newspapers featuring stories about their dinner together, the legal pad covered in her handwritten notes about her father's case. "I needed to see you," he continued, his voice carrying an urgency she hadn't heard before. "Things are moving faster than I anticipated, and you need to understand what's really happening." Mary maintained her distance, acutely aware of the last time they had been alone together. The memory of their kiss in the White House dining room still haunted her, complicated now by what she knew about her father's death. Calloway seemed to sense her wariness. He remained near the door, his hands open at his sides in a gesture that managed to be both disarming and presidential. "McCandy is planning to move against several key members of my administration," he said. "He's using what he has on you, on your father, as leverage to force my hand on certain policies. But there's more to this than you know." The words hung in the air between them as Calloway moved closer, his presence magnetic despite her reservations. "Your father wasn't just a union leader, Mary. He was working with a group inside the government, people trying to expose corruption at the highest levels. I've been tracking this since before I took office, trying to understand how deep it goes." He reached for her hand, and Mary found herself allowing the contact, even as Daniel's warnings echoed in her mind. Calloway's fingers were warm against hers, his touch sending familiar electricity through her body. "I couldn't save your father," he continued softly, "but I can protect you if you'll trust me." The moment was shattered by another knock at the door. Mary's heart stopped when she saw Daniel through the peephole, case files tucked under his arm. Before she could warn him away, he used his spare key, the one she'd given him years ago for emergencies. The door swung open, and three worlds collided in her small living room. Daniel froze mid-step, taking in the scene before him, Mary and the president standing close together, their hands just now pulling apart. The Secret Service agents moved to intercept him, but Calloway waved them off with practiced authority. The tension in the room ratcheted up to unbearable levels. "Mr. Reynolds," Calloway said smoothly, though a muscle ticked in his jaw, "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised to find you here. Your investigation into my administration has been thorough." The words carried layers of meaning, and Mary saw Daniel's hand tighten on his files. She stood between them, physically and metaphorically caught between two men who represented vastly different versions of truth and trust. Daniel's eyes met hers, filled with questions and barely concealed hurt. The files he carried, she knew, contained more evidence about her father's death, evidence that might implicate the man standing on her other side. Daniel was the first to break the charged silence. "I have proof, Mr. President," he said, his journalist's instincts overriding any protocol about confronting the most powerful man in the country. documents showing exactly how the operation against Thomas Muntroud was organized and how it connects to current members of your administration. He moved to the coffee table, spreading out papers with deliberate precision. Mary watched Calloway's face, searching for any reaction that might reveal his true involvement. The president's expression remained carefully neutral, but she noticed his hands flex slightly at his sides. "Everything you have is part of a larger picture, Mr. Reynolds," Calloway responded, his voice carrying the weight of authority even in this informal setting. A picture that, if revealed improperly, could destabilize more than just a few corrupt officials. He turned to Mary, his eyes softening almost imperceptibly. "Your father discovered one piece of a vast network. McCandy and his allies are just the surface. There are forces at work that would think nothing of eliminating anyone who threatens their control, including talented musicians who ask too many questions." The implied threat and protection in his words made Mary's skin prickle. Daniel moved closer to Mary, his protective instinct visible in every line of his body. "And where exactly do you fit into this network, Mr. President?" he challenged. "The evidence suggests your administration has been actively suppressing investigations into McCandy's activities." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Mary felt the tension between the two men building to dangerous levels. She stepped away from both of them, needing space to think clearly. Her apartment felt like a pressure cooker filled with too many unspoken words and competing truths. "You want proof of where I stand?" Calloway asked, reaching into his jacket. He withdrew a small flash drive and held it out to Mary. "Everything I've gathered over the past 5 years, about McCandy, about the network he serves, about your father's real mission. Take it or don't, but know that once you look at what's on here, there's no going back." His eyes held hers, and in them she saw something that looked like genuine concern, possibly even deeper feelings. But when she glanced at Daniel, she saw the same emotions reflected there, backed by years of proven loyalty and trust. The choice lay before her, like a crossroads. Daniel's files offered one version of the truth, documented and verified through months of careful investigation. Calloway's flash drive promised another, possibly larger truth, but one that required a leap of faith. As she stood there, the weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her shoulders, Mary realized that her decision in this moment would set in motion events that couldn't be undone. The rain had started again outside, drumming against her windows like a deadline. Both men watched her, waiting, while somewhere in the city, McCandy's machinery of power continued to turn, grinding away at the foundations of everything she had ever believed in. The underground parking garage echoed with Mary's footsteps as she hurried toward her contact's designated meeting spot. 2 days had passed since the confrontation in her apartment, and she had spent every moment since then analyzing the contents of both Calloway's flash drive and Daniel's files. The information pointed to a massive conspiracy, but crucial pieces were still missing. Her source, a former aide to McCandy who had reached out through Daniel's network, promised to fill in those gaps. The flickering fluorescent lights cast moving shadows that made her jump at every corner, while the detection device in her purse remained suspiciously quiet. A car engine rumbled in the distance, the sound bouncing off concrete walls in a way that made it impossible to locate. Mary checked her phone, still 10 minutes early for the meeting. The source had been specific about the timing, warning that any deviation could compromise everything. She thought about Calloway's warning about forces willing to eliminate threats, about the evidence of her father's murder. The garage felt suddenly like a trap, but before she could act on that instinct, she heard footsteps approaching from multiple directions. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. The first attacker emerged from behind a concrete pillar, a professional in a dark suit, moving with practiced efficiency. 2 more appeared from different directions, cutting off her escape routes. None of them spoke, but their intentions were clear in the way they moved, in the glint of metal in their hands. Mary's mind flashed to the self-defense classes she'd taken after Daniel's first warnings. She backed away, looking for any advantage in the sparse environment. Her hand closed around the small canister of pepper spray in her coat pocket, a gift from Daniel that she had hoped never to use. Everything happened at once. The first man lunged forward, reaching for her arm. Mary ducked and spun, years of dance training making her movements fluid. The pepper spray caught him directly in the face, his cry of pain echoing through the garage. The second attacker was more cautious, trying to circle around while the third moved to cut off her retreat. The detection device in her purse suddenly came to life, beeping frantically. Not from surveillance equipment, she realized, but from the signal jammers they were using to block communications. A squeal of tires announced Daniel's arrival, his car bursting through the garage entrance like an avenging angel. He had insisted on following her at a distance, despite her protests about being able to handle herself. Now, as his headlights illuminated the scene, Mary had never been more grateful for his protective instincts. The attackers scattered, professional enough to know when a situation had become too complicated. Daniel's car skidded to a stop beside her, the passenger door flying open. "Get in," he shouted, already reaching across to help pull her inside. They burst out of the garage into the rain-slicked streets of Washington, Daniel's hands tight on the wheel as he navigated through traffic with controlled urgency. "They were waiting for you," he said, his voice tight with anger and fear. "This wasn't a random attack. They knew exactly when and where you'd be." Mary's hands were shaking as she tried to process how close she had come to sharing her father's fate. She looked at Daniel's profile, saw the muscle working in his jaw, the way his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "We need to get somewhere safe," he continued, checking the rearview mirror for any signs of pursuit. The somewhere safe turned out to be a small hotel on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place that didn't ask questions and dealt primarily in cash. Daniel had prepared for this contingency, had a go-bag ready in his trunk with necessities for both of them. As they hurried through the rain to their room, Mary caught him watching her with an intensity that made her heart race for reasons entirely unrelated to their escape. He had almost lost her tonight, and that knowledge seemed to have stripped away some of his careful restraint. Inside the room, Mary paced while Daniel secured the door and checked the windows. The adrenaline was still coursing through her system, making her movements jerky and uncertain. "We need to call Calloway," she said, running her hands through her rain-dampened hair. "If he was telling the truth about protecting me—" Daniel cut her off by grabbing her shoulders, forcing her to stop pacing and look at him. "Mary," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "we can't trust anyone right now, not even him, especially not him." The intensity of his grip, the closeness of his body, the way his eyes searched her face, it all combined with the aftermath of danger to create a moment of electric tension. Mary was suddenly acutely aware of how alone they were, how many years of unspoken feelings lay between them. Daniel's hands softened on her shoulders, one sliding up to cup her cheek. She could feel his heart racing, matching the tempo of her own. The line they had never crossed seemed to blur in the face of how close they had come to losing everything. But before either of them could act on the charged moment, Daniel's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. They jumped apart, the spell broken by reality crashing back in. The message was from one of his sources, an urgent warning that McCandy's men were mobilizing across the city. More importantly, there were orders originating from within the White House itself, orders that seemed to confirm their worst fears about Calloway's true role in everything. Mary sank onto the bed, the weight of betrayal heavy on her shoulders. Daniel sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, offering silent support as they both stared at the damning evidence on his phone screen. The rain continued to pour outside, washing away their last illusions about who they could trust in this deadly game of power and deception. The National Gallery of Art had been transformed into a glittering fortress for the annual presidential gala. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the marble floors, while Secret Service agents blended seamlessly with the black-tie crowd. Mary adjusted the miniature recording device hidden in her diamond earrings, courtesy of Daniel's investigative connections, and tried to appear calm as she made her way through the security checkpoint. Her burgundy gown concealed the bruises from the parking garage attack, but nothing could hide the tension in her shoulders as she spotted McCandy holding court near a Renaissance painting, his laugh carrying across the room like a threat. President Calloway stood at the center of the grand hall, every inch the powerful leader in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. Their eyes met across the room, and Mary felt the familiar pull of attraction warring with her growing suspicion. The encrypted orders from the White House that Daniel had intercepted suggested Calloway's involvement in the garage attack, but something about those orders felt off, too obvious, too easily traced. She watched him work the crowd, noting how his smile never quite reached his eyes when he spoke with McCandy's associates. The question that had haunted her for days remained. Was he a master manipulator, or was he playing a deeper game? The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Mary's heart skipped as Calloway made his way toward her. This was part of the plan. She needed to get close to him, to plant the bug Daniel had given her that would allow them to monitor his private conversations. But as he extended his hand in invitation, she found herself thinking less about the mission and more about the last time they had been this close, in the private dining room where everything had changed. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice carrying that same magnetic authority that had first drawn her in. As she placed her hand in his, she wondered if she was walking into another trap. They moved across the dance floor with practiced grace, their bodies remembering the steps even as their minds raced with ulterior motives. "You're being watched," Calloway murmured, his lips close to her ear under the pretense of an intimate conversation. "McCandy's men are positioned at every exit. Whatever you're planning tonight, be careful." His warning could have been genuine concern or a subtle threat. Everything about him had become a riddle she couldn't solve. Mary felt the bug in her clutch, wondering if she dared to plant it on him when he might be expecting exactly that. From her position on the dance floor, Mary could see Daniel moving through the crowd in his role as a credentialed journalist. He looked devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo, though few would notice the concealed camera in his glasses or the tension in his movements as he positioned himself to document any suspicious interactions. Their eyes met briefly as Calloway turned her in the dance, and Mary saw Daniel's jaw clench at their proximity. The memory of their almost kiss in the hotel room flashed through her mind, making her steps falter slightly. Calloway's hand tightened on her waist, steadying her with an intimacy that felt both dangerous and thrilling. The music ended, but before Calloway could lead her off the dance floor, McCandy appeared beside them like a shadow made flesh. "Mr. President," he said, his smile cold as ice, "might I borrow Ms. Muntroud for a moment? There are some cultural initiative details we need to discuss." The request was perfectly polite, yet Mary felt Calloway's entire body tense. His hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary as he released her, and she caught something in his eyes. A warning? A signal? Before she could decipher it, McCandy was leading her away, his grip on her elbow just tight enough to remind her of the power. He wielded. McCandy guided her to a private alcove, partially hidden behind a massive classical sculpture. "Your little investigation ends tonight," he said without preamble, his political smoothness dropping away to reveal the predator beneath. "We've been monitoring your communications with Reynolds. Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" He pulled out his phone, showing her a live security feed of Daniel moving through the gallery's west wing. "Your journalist friend is about to have an unfortunate accident. Unless, of course, you're ready to be more cooperative." The threat hung in the air between them, making the ornate gallery feel suddenly airless. Mary's mind raced as she weighed her options. The recording device in her earrings was capturing everything, but would it matter if Daniel was eliminated? She thought of her father, of how he must have faced similar choices before they silenced him. With deliberate calm, she reached into her clutch, pretending to check her makeup while actually pressing the emergency signal button Daniel had given her. "You're not going to hurt anyone else," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I have evidence of everything, the corruption, the murders, all of it. One signal from me and it goes to every major news outlet in the country. McCandy's laugh was chilling in its genuine amusement. "My dear, you've watched too many movies. There won't be any last-minute revelations or heroic escapes tonight." He gestured subtly, and Mary noticed several men in dark suits moving to block the alcove's exits. "Check your phone," he continued with satisfaction. "You'll find your signal has been quite thoroughly blocked." Mary's blood ran cold as she realized he was right. Her phone showed no service, and the emergency button's confirmation light hadn't come on. Through a gap in the crowd, she saw Daniel disappearing down a hallway, followed by two men who moved with the same professional menace as her garage attackers. The next few moments seemed to happen in slow motion. Mary saw Calloway across the room, deep in conversation with foreign dignitaries, apparently oblivious to her situation. She saw Daniel's phone lying discarded near a potted plant, its screen cracked. And she saw the genuine triumph in McCandy's eyes as he watched her realize how completely they had been outmaneuvered. The beautiful gallery, with its priceless art and glittering guests, had become a gilded cage. As the orchestra struck up another waltz, Mary felt the walls closing in, knowing that somewhere in this maze of marble and shadow, Daniel was fighting for his life, while she stood trapped between two versions of power, one that wore its corruption openly and one that hid its true nature behind presidential authority and devastating charm. The private salon off the main gallery was a study in old-world opulence, its walls lined with priceless paintings that had witnessed centuries of political intrigue. Mary's heels sank into the thick carpet as she followed President Calloway inside, her heart thundering against her ribs. She had managed to slip away from McCandy's men during a commotion in the main hall, a dropped tray of champagne that she suspected wasn't entirely accidental, given the way Calloway's eyes had flickered to her just before it happened. Now, as he closed the heavy doors behind them, she felt the weight of the recording device in her earrings, knowing this might be her only chance to get the truth. "They have Daniel," she said without preamble, watching Calloway's face for any reaction. He moved to the wet bar, his back to her, as he poured 2 glasses of scotch. The casual gesture felt incongruous with the urgency of the moment, but Mary recognized it as the power play it was, forcing her to wait for his response, maintaining control of the situation. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was carefully neutral, but something in his eyes had changed. "I know," he said simply, offering her one of the glasses. "And I know about the recording device you're wearing. The question is, Mary, do you want to know what's really going on?" The scotch burned her throat as she took a deliberate sip, buying time to study him. Gone was the smooth charm of their dance earlier, replaced by something harder, more focused. "Your orders," she said, thinking of the intercepted White House communications. "They led to the attack in the garage. You're working with McCandy, aren't you?" But even as she made the accusation, doubt crept in. She remembered the way he had tensed when McCandy approached them on the dance floor, the warning in his eyes as she was led away. Calloway set his glass down and moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, could see the faint lines of strain around his eyes. "Those orders were planted," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent the last 5 years building a case against McCandy and his network. Your father," he paused, watching her reaction carefully. "Your father was one of our key informants before they got to him. I couldn't save him then, but I've been working ever since to dismantle the organization that killed him. Every meeting, every document, every piece of evidence has been carefully orchestrated to draw them out." He reached for her hand, and Mary felt something small and metallic being pressed into her palm, a tiny USB drive, barely larger than her thumbnail. "This is everything. The real evidence, not the fragments they've been feeding us." Mary's mind raced as the pieces began falling into place. Calloway's careful ambiguity, the way he had positioned himself between her and McCandy's influence, even their kiss in the private dining room. "The dinner," she said, realization dawning. "You knew they were watching. You were giving me a cover story, a reason to be close to you that they would believe." He nodded, and for the first time she saw genuine regret in his expression. I didn't expect to, he started, then stopped himself. The unfinished sentence hung between them, heavy with implications about feelings that might have been real despite the deception. A noise in the hallway made them both tense. Through the ornate doors, they could hear McCandy's voice approaching, accompanied by multiple footsteps. "They're moving faster than I expected," Calloway said, his presidential facade dropping completely to reveal the strategist beneath. "Daniel is being held in the basement archives. My people are moving to secure him, but we need to keep McCandy distracted." He pulled a phone from his pocket, clicking through screens faster than Mary could follow. "When I give the signal, every major news outlet in the country will receive the first wave of evidence. But we need his confession, Mary. The recording device you're wearing, it's our best chance to get him on record." The footsteps grew closer, and Mary felt panic rising in her throat. "Why should I trust you now?" she demanded, even as she tucked the USB drive into her bodice. "After all the lies, the manipulation." Calloway cut her off by grabbing her shoulders, his touch firm but not rough. "Because I made a promise to your father," he said intensely. "Because everything I've done, including letting you believe the worst of me, has been to protect you while we built this case. And because—" he hesitated, then pulled her closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, "because what happened between us wasn't part of the plan. It wasn't supposed to be real, but it was. It is." Before Mary could process this confession, the doors burst open. McCandy entered like a storm cloud in a tuxedo, flanked by two of his men. His face showed no surprise at finding them together. Clearly, he had been expecting this. "How touching," he said, his voice dripping with cold amusement. "The president and the singer sharing one last intimate moment. Did you really think we wouldn't figure it out, Edward? That we wouldn't see this pathetic attempt to build a case against me?" He pulled out a gun, the metal gleaming dully in the salon's soft lighting. 5 years of careful planning, undone by your weakness for a pretty face and a sad story." Mary felt Calloway tense beside her, but his voice remained steady as he responded. "You're wrong, James, about everything, including who has the upper hand here." He made a subtle gesture with his hand. The signal, Mary realized, watching the color drain from McCandy's face as his phone buzzed with multiple notifications. Around them, they could hear commotion building in the main gallery as the news broke. But McCandy's grip on his gun only tightened, his expression turning desperate. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking you both with me, just like I took care of her bleeding heart father." The next few moments seemed to unfold in slow motion. Mary saw McCandy's finger tightening on the trigger, saw Calloway moving to shield her, saw the door behind McCandy opening to reveal Daniel, bruised but alive, wielding what appeared to be a heavy archive book. The crash, as the book connected with McCandy's head, was oddly anticlimactic, but the effect was immediate. The gun clattered to the floor as McCandy stumbled, his security men too surprised by Daniel's appearance to react before Secret Service agents flooded the room, their weapons drawn and their loyalties clear. As McCandy was secured and Daniel made his way to her side, Mary found herself shaking with delayed reaction. The recording device in her earrings had captured everything: McCandy's confession, the revelation of Calloway's true motives, the final confrontation. She felt Daniel's arms slip around her waist, steadying her, while Calloway directed the organized chaos of McCandy's arrest. The two men's eyes met over her head, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They had both been protecting her in their own ways, both fighting the same enemy from different angles. But as the adrenaline of the moment began to fade, Mary realized that the hardest decision still lay ahead, not about justice or truth, but about her own heart and which of these two men had truly earned its trust. The morning headlines screamed across every major newspaper in Washington: Senator McCandy arrested in massive corruption scandal. Mary sat in her apartment surrounded by papers, each one carrying variations of the same story. The evidence released by the White House had blown the conspiracy wide open. Decades of corruption, blackmail, and murder, all laid bare in headlines and carefully worded exposés. Daniel's byline appeared on several of the most damning articles, his meticulous investigation finally seeing the light of day. Through her window, she could see news vans still camped outside her building, hungry for more details about her role in the scandal that had shaken the nation's capital to its core. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Calls from journalists, talk show hosts, even Hollywood producers wanting the rights to her story. She ignored them all, focusing instead on the document in her hands. It was her father's full case file, finally declassified on President Callaway's orders. The truth of his work as an undercover informant, his efforts to expose the corruption that had ultimately cost him his life, was now a matter of public record. His name had been cleared, his mission revealed as one of patriotism rather than betrayal. Mary traced her fingers over his photograph, wishing he could see how it had all ended, how his sacrifice had finally led to justice. The press conference at the White House had been a masterclass in political theater. Callaway had stood at the podium, his presence commanding, as he detailed the years-long operation to bring down McCandy's network. He spoke of dedicated public servants working in the shadows, of the price paid by whistleblowers like Thomas Muntroud, of the delicate balance between justice and security. When he mentioned Mary's role in the final phase of the operation, his voice had softened almost imperceptibly, but she had noticed, just as she had noticed Daniel, standing in the press corps, his expression carefully neutral as he watched the man who had been both rival and unexpected ally. Now, 3 days later, Mary found herself outside the Oval Office, preparing for what she knew would be more than just a debriefing. The familiar weight of attraction and complexity hung in the air as she was shown in. Callaway stood at the window, his back to the door, looking every inch the powerful leader who had orchestrated McCandy's downfall. But when he turned to face her, she saw something else in his eyes: vulnerability, hope, and a question he hadn't yet asked. The room felt charged with possibility and the weight of choices yet to be made. "The investigation is officially closed," Callaway said, moving to sit not behind his desk but in one of the casual chairs, inviting her to join him. "McCandy and his associates will spend the rest of their lives in prison. Your father's full pension and benefits will be restored to your family, along with a formal commendation for his service." He paused, watching her carefully. "You're free now, Mary. Free to pursue your music without their influence. Free to tell your story however you choose. Free to—" He hesitated, then continued softly. "Free to explore whatever feelings might exist between us, without the shadow of deception." The offer hung in the air, tempting in its promise of power, passion, and purpose. Mary could see the path it offered. A life of influence and excitement, of making real change from within the system, of turning their complicated beginning into something genuine and potentially beautiful. Callaway reached for her hand, and she felt the same electricity that had first drawn them together, but now it was accompanied by the weight of everything that had happened, every lie and half-truth, every moment of doubt and manipulation, even if it had been for the greater good. Her thoughts drifted to the previous evening, spent in Daniel's apartment as they worked on his latest article. The comfortable familiarity of their interaction, the way he knew exactly how she took her coffee, the shared history that no amount of political intrigue could erase. They had talked for hours about the future, her music, his journalism, the truth they had fought so hard to expose. There had been no pressure, no grand gestures, just the solid foundation of trust they had built over years. When he had finally kissed her, it had felt like coming home rather than embarking on an adventure. "I can't," she said finally, gently withdrawing her hand from Callaway's grasp. "What we felt, what we feel, it's real. I believe that now. But it was born in a world of shadows and secrets, and I need to step into the light." She stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that didn't shake. "I've spent so long being defined by other people's power, McCandy's threats, my father's legacy, even your protection. I need to find out who I am without all of that." Callaway nodded, understanding and regret mingling in his expression as he too rose to his feet. The goodbye wasn't bitter or dramatic. They spoke briefly about the future, her upcoming testimony to Congress, his continued work to reform the system from within. As she turned to leave, he called out one last time, "You know, I think this is why I fell for you in the first place," he said, a sad smile playing at his lips. "Your strength was never in the power you could gain, but in your ability to walk away from it." Mary returned his smile, acknowledging the compliment and the closure it offered. Then she walked out of the Oval Office, her steps light, despite the gravity of the moment. The sun was setting over the National Mall as Mary made her way down the White House steps for the last time. Daniel waited by his car, leaning against the hood with the casual confidence of someone who knew his place in the world. As she approached, he straightened up, watching her with eyes that held questions but no demands. She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers as they looked out over the city they had helped to change. Tomorrow, there would be more stories to write, more songs to sing, more truths to tell. But for now, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the fading light paint the monuments in shades of gold. Mary felt the last weight lift from her shoulders as she realized that true freedom wasn't in the power you gained, but in the power you chose to walk away from. She squeezed Daniel's hand, and together they drove away from the circles of power and toward whatever future they would build on their own terms.